again, these different little schemas that I've tried to put together in order to try to understand all these different words and theories and how they fit together. And I've presented this idea of orienting, anchoring, identifying. If the base phenomenon, if you will, is attending, right? So we're focusing attention. And when you trace back further, you get into more and more esoteric, more and more philosophical territory as far as, well, what's attending, who's attending, what is attention? And of course, you start getting into what is a phenomenon versus what is an ontological entity. If you just start with, okay, there's attention. Again, similar to if you use light as a analogy, obviously we're aware that light will emanate or radiate from a source. Generally speaking, the primary light source that we humans are aware of and as far as we can tell are fed by, nurtured by, illuminated by is the sun. That's the primary light source. Even the lamp you turn on, even the lava that is in the earth core, it's all really sunlight. So if all light is really sunlight, there's that idea that all consciousness, if consciousness is light, all consciousness is really emanating from some kind of source, right? And that's a common word people will use these days as a substitute for God. You know, the atheists would rather say source than God. The general idea is like whatever source really is, right? We seem to have this awareness that there's this light emanating from it, or this idea that there's consciousness being created from, emanating from somewhere. So again, if we kind of start with forgetting about what the actual source is, but we look at, okay, there's this light that's traveling through space. And if you say that light is attention, then it's okay, well, what is happening with that light? What's it shining on, so to speak? Which would be like saying, what are we attending to? One of the big distinctions that I'm making is that we all just kind of focus attention not only on this and then on that and then on this and then on that. And not only do we shift from object to object with our attention, but one of the big important things, and this is where the idea of dimensions comes in, we not only shift from object to object, but we will shift how we're attending from context to context. And we just do this, for the most part, real seamlessly. We will focus attention on a certain context, and then boom, we'll shift to a different context. And that occurs as far as paying attention to the gross physical world, right? One second we're paying attention to, what's going on in the room that we're physically in. But then boom, you can shift to what's going on your property, or what's going on in your house overall, or what's going on in that closet over there. So there's all these different physical spaces that you can be paying attention to. And you can, depending on what you're doing, you decide, okay, it doesn't matter what's out beyond that context or that dimension or that spatial area. You're talking about what's going on in that spatial area. And of course, if you're going to have a conversation with someone else about what's going on in a certain space, you need to both be talking about the same space, obviously. And then one of the big shifts is because when I explain that, it's like, well, duh, we all know this. But what we don't seem to know, or we don't seem to kind of take into account on a regular basis, is that we're doing the same thing emotionally, we're doing the same thing mentally. And so it becomes less obvious to try to talk about what emotional context are we talking about here? What mental context are we talking about? If it's not a gross physical area, if we're talking about emotional area, if we're talking about concepts, especially if you start getting into abstract ideas. It gets even more complicated when we start talking about whose emotion are we talking about? Are we talking about mine? Are we talking about yours? Are we talking about ours? Are we talking about a particular population? What kind of energetic context are we talking about? Are we talking about what's going on in a certain part of my first chakra? Are we talking about my first chakra as a whole? Are we talking about yours? Are we talking about the interaction between mine and yours? Are you talking about what my first chakra does when I'm on the playing field? Are you talking about what my first chakra does when I'm interacting as a father? Are you talking about what my first chakra does when I'm just walking from here to there? So it's obviously this just infinite sea of contexts, infinite sea of dimensions. As I keep saying over and over again, it's a different thing to pay attention to the content in a particular dimension at any given moment than to pay attention to what dimension am I in? What is the context? What's the context? What's the context? What's the context? That's tracking in a different way. In the same way that when you're looking at your computer screen, if you decide, okay, I'm going to open this window and I'm going to open this file and then I'm going to read this file, it's like, okay, you've settled in on that. If you're not reading the right file or if you're not in the right folder, you're not even going to find that file. And of course, it goes on and on. And again, it's a different thing to sit down at your computer and try to be managing files versus dealing with the content of a certain file. If attention, again, is the base or primary, we know that we attend to stuff. We know that we shift from object to object, or we can. When we talk more about object relating, we'll talk about the kind of experience where you're not picking an object. But if we say we can shift from object to object, we can also shift from context to context, which would be dimension to dimension. Another step from there is, well, where are you attending from when you're looking at this object or that context? What organ, for example, what organ of experience are you attending from? Now, again, it's obvious if to discern, well, am I attending with my ears or am I attending with my eyes? Am I trying to get a sense of something auditorily or visually? Those are real obvious shifts as far as which organ. When you get past the 5 gross physical senses and you start getting into, for example, what chakra am I attending with right now? Well, that's a completely different kind of deal, but it's just as important as if you say, are we attending auditorily or visually right now? If I'm trying to point something out to you and I'm saying, do you hear that? And then you're looking around the room or you're sniffing around the room and I'm saying, I'm not talking about something you can see or smell. I'm saying, do you hear that noise? And it's like you've got to, if we're going to have any communication, you're obviously going to have to understand what I'm talking about and then shift and start paying attention auditorily, meaning the various mechanisms that you use to pick up sound, rather than sniffing or trying to focus your eyes harder or looking under the bed. But it's kind of that ridiculous with regard to chakras, that there's all this communication or miscommunication that occurs because we are attending with a certain chakra and then someone else is attending with a different chakra, and then they're having a conversation, for example, as if they're attending from the same place. And of course, it becomes impossible for communication to happen. And not only does that kind of thing play out relationally, it plays out within your own system. It plays out with regard to awakening, healing, growth, and performance. So what are you attending to, which is the same thing as what are you aware of? Where are you attending from, which is the orientation thing? Where are you aware from? What organ of experience are you using to attend with? Anchoring is what are you locking onto? What are you tracking? If you're playing a sport that involves a ball, you might be tracking the ball, right? You're tracking the ball. You're anchoring in the ball. If you're driving down the street, no matter what else you're doing with your attention, you need to keep tracking your lane, for example. You can't let your attention go too long without coming back to, am I still in my lane? Am I still in my lane? Tracking the lane. And of course, we can attend to lots of things simultaneously, but in lots of activities, or you could say really in all activities, we have to anchor somewhere. Otherwise, it just starts to be chaotic. And of course, again, depending on what you're trying to have happen, what you should be anchoring in changes. And so again, there's obvious implications as far as performing an activity, as far as relating with someone. We get stuck anchoring somewhere for various reasons. We'll get stuck and we kind of fixate, right? We obsessively anchor in a certain dimension. And that only serves us when we're doing an activity that anchoring in that place is, what's appropriate. But again, we don't realize we're anchoring in the wrong place, and we don't realize that we're having a hard time shifting off of that anchor. And so becoming aware of where am I anchoring right now is huge. So orienting, anchoring, identifying. Orienting's where are you looking from? Anchoring is what are you referencing? What are you tracking? What are you orienting to? Not what are you orienting from, but what are you orienting to? And then the third piece, identifying. What is self? Right? What is self? Which can be various things. When I say what is self, I'm saying what is your experience of self? I'm not saying what's actual self. I'm saying what's your experience of self at any given moment. When you're playing a video game, what is self is whatever the little character is in the video game that's supposed to be you, right? You're experiencing that as self, which would be object relating. The more you're kind of in the video game and being that particular character in the video game, you're being that. If you're watching a movie, if you're really getting into the movie, you leave who you usually are, and now you're in the movie and you're typically identifying with one of the characters, for example, typically the protagonist. So we all know this watching a movie, and we take that ride willingly, and we get to have this experience. If the movie sucks, it doesn't pull us into that kind of identification, and so we find ourselves being aware of sitting there watching this movie, which makes us start to not want to watch the rest of the movie. But what we don't realize is we're doing the same thing in quote unquote real life, right? We're doing this moment to moment in, for example, the gross physical world. We're being this object, we're being that object, we're being the other person, we're being a part of our own body, right? We're being our biceps, we're being our ass, we're being our face, we're being someone else's face. We're just constantly attending to objects and then experiencing them as self. And again, this is what object relating is. And object relating, we object relate moment to moment with all kinds of stuff, but then there's deeper, more chronic, more permanent object relating we do. And again, we'll get deeper into that. But this idea of identity, we're always having an experience of identity. Even if we're having an identity crisis, then we're experiencing lack of identity. But it's still this identity situation. So identity is a huge issue. And in the world of psychology, this is well known. And the first three schools of psychotherapy, meaning psychoanalysis, ego psychology, and self-psychology, are all very concerned with identity. All the schools really are. But identity is really the central piece of these psychologies. What is your ego doing? What is your sense of self? And in psychoanalysis, it's what are you allowing as far as experience? What kind of experience are you allowing? And what it comes back to is, what does that experience say about self? That's how our psyche works. The concern is self. The concern is identity. That became the focus at a certain point in history, in philosophy, in psychology, and of course in spirituality and religion. This idea of self became important. And of course the idea is that at a certain point in history, humans started to become aware of, not just from, they started to become aware of some idea of self. And so again, the idea that human history and an individual's history, they correlate developmentally. So a young child is just attending from, and they're identifying with the world that they're attending to. But at some point, typically around, age, it varies a lot, obviously, but pre-adolescence, there starts to be an awareness of self, of individuality. And so instead of just being aware of the group around you, for example, and identifying with them, or being aware of your mom, or being aware of your dad, you start to be aware of quote unquote self. And of course, when this initially happens, the idea is we can't feel self. When we actually start to attend back to ourselves, the experience is, there's nothing there. We can't see it. And so the ego mind registers a vacuum, a void. And it's terrifying. The idea is that it's terrifying. And what we do before we even become conscious of it, before we even become ego aware of it, what we do is we substitute something for that void. And the general idea is we substitute an image in our mind. So Jacques Lacan's idea of the mirror moment, he lays this out real explicitly, where he says that the child has a certain experience, literally with a mirror, where the child first apprehends with his or her mind that image in the mirror is me. And when the child does that, boom, they sort of lock in on it, and now they have this image in their mind of what self is. And then they go forth in life and spend the rest of their life having that be the primary identity. And of course, the idea is it's really just an image. It's not an actual self. Okay, so identity. The general idea is for some strange reason, humans aren't in touch with actual identity. Awakening, the idea of awakening, enlightenment, self-realization, etc. The base idea there is that it's about becoming conscious of true identity. And so, of course, some people think, well, that's bullshit. There is no true identity. Generally speaking, the existential school of thought is that there is no actual identity. There just isn't one. The truth is nothing. The truth is that there's a nothingness. Our concept of identity is a kind of a losing game from the start, meaning if we're looking for an actuality, if we're looking for an actual ontological entity, you're not going to find it. The spiritual view is that there is ontology. There are actual beings. So again, we'll get way more into that when we dive further into the consciousness work stuff. But what there's general agreement on is, okay, whether there's an actual identity or not. The way the human psyche works is that there's various ways the human psyche experiences an identity. And there's also general agreement that there's a growth process, a developmental process that requires varying types of experiences of identity. That a child, for example, that it is healthy and good and important and even necessary for a child to identify with a primary other. And that primary other, which is usually mother, but obviously it can be whoever, that primary other becomes the primary object that the child orients to and identifies with. So experiences selfhood as that primary other or primary object. The word object is used just to sort of delineate a context, obviously. I mean, there's a reason they're not saying subject, right? Because the idea is it's an object, but the person is actually experiencing that object as subject. And again, when we get further into consciousness work, we'll go a lot deeper into what is subject-object dualism and what's the difference between a subject and an object. But so the child orients to, let's say, mother. Mother is the object in the child's awareness that the child anchors in. And not only do they anchor in, they also identify as. So this is in object relations theory, this is the primary object. And the idea there is that the child literally experiences it that way. And that we grow up, and once we can even talk, and once we can even say, no, of course, I'm not my mother. I'm me. My mother's over there. I'm over here. My mother has different thoughts and emotions than I do. We're two separate people. I am not object relating with my mother, for God's sake. And it's like, yes, you are. Yes, you are. And if and so you got to like dive deeper and get a sense of what are we really talking about here when you say, you are still object related with your mother, even though you're 80 and your mother's been dead for 40 years, you're still object relating with your mother. And it's like, okay, what are we talking about? And if I tried to sum that up real quick, it's that these deeper functions in our psyche, again, orient, anchor, and identify in ways that our cerebral cortex isn't aware of. And we maintain these orientations, these anchors, the identifications, even when our cerebral cortex, even when our mental, conceptual, cognitive functioning says otherwise. Even when we say, even when we're in conflict with it and say, I know I don't want to be identified with my mother. It's like it's still there. These underlying structures are still there. And the word structure, psychic structure, meaning structures of the psyche. I don't mean psychic awareness. Psychic awareness is a different, psychic awareness as opposed to mental, as opposed to physical. That words can be used in that way, but psychic structure in psychology just means structures of the psyche. The idea is that the psyche is structured. We have structures in our psyche that we use to orient, anchor, and identify. So now not only do we have physical senses, not only do we have chakras, but we have minds, right? Our mind forms structures that we use to organize information. We, in a very complete, thorough way, we orient, anchor, and identify via our psychic structures. And so, for example, with object relations theory, it's not, if you're object related with your mother, what the idea there, the theory is, and this will help explain, well, how could you still be object related with your mother, let's say if your mother passed away a long time ago, is because what you've really done is you have created a structure in your psyche that is a representation of your mother. And then your psyche is actually orienting to and anchoring in that structure, which again, if you really get a sense of that and consider the implications of that, it's massive. And it's sort of sad because it's like, oh my God, we're all actually just relating to these internal structures in our psyche more than we're actually relating to the other person. You're looking at your mother, interacting with your mother, but you're not really seeing your mother. You're not really like deeply relating with your mother. You're deeply relating with your own internalized structures of your mother. And we're doing this, with all our relationships. And we're doing it with our relationship to our own self. It starts to make sense that object relations theory, which is a school of psychology that looks at and deals with what's going on in a individual's psyche as far as their structures. And structural theory in general, which, for example, the psychoanalytic school is deeply structural. It's a structural theoretical orientation. They are therapies that are looking at what are the structures in a person's psyche. As I've mentioned, this shift in psychotherapy and in philosophy in general and in culture, there's been a shift away from structural theory towards this idea of cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral theory and orientation. There's been a shift, the postmodern, post-structural shift, right? There was the structural period in philosophy, and then there's post-structural. There's this sense that we have freedom of thought, freedom of ideas, freedom of beliefs, and this idea of, wait a minute, forget all these structures. Let's shift up into this part of our psyche where we can choose. Forget my upbringing, forget the religious dogma that was rammed down my throat, forget my parents and their stupid old-fashioned ways. Forget lessons of human history. I'm my own person in the present, and I have freedom of choice, and I choose my reality, and I choose this instead of that. And while there's a certain amount of importance and validity to that, at the same time, my view is that is massively stupid, massively naive, massively immature, and worse than all that, it's incredibly dangerous. And the general idea, that view that I'm coming from right now, is that there's a real threat to civilization as a whole because of that kind of phenomenon, because of people throwing away the idea of structure and thinking they have some kind of autonomous mechanism in their psyche that has the freedom to choose, and that it's not highly influenced by structure, whether you think it is or not, and that simply denying those structures and thinking you just get to choose your own reality is really an attempt at programming yourself. And another aspect of that is that there's the idea that what you think is good, what you think is self, how you think people should behave, how you think society should be organized. It's like, where are you getting that information, right? How are you thinking what's best? It's incredibly narcissistic and arrogant. And it's it's that general idea. It's like if you go into a garden and you decide, what we need to do here is we need to get rid of all these yucky worms, and we need to like kill off, these bees because they sting you, and you start making all these changes that fit your individual, even just the idea of anthropomorphic, sensibilities. And it's like you aren't understanding the overall structure here, and you're going to devastate the environment when you try to have the environment change to match your naive, immature, arrogant, self-centered perspective on the universe. And again, we're doing that as a society. We're doing that. We're doing that to the environment. We're doing that to culture. We're doing that to our own bodies. We're doing it to each other. We're coming from this place in the mind that thinks it has arrived at some kind of truth. It thinks it's arrived at a wokeness that thinks that it knows how everything ought to be, and that it would all be utopia if we just enforce it. And it's incredibly dangerous. Sorry, I slid into the political.
Yeah, it got dark there. Well, I think it's just I think what it complicates it, or what is a really big risk about it, is that, like you're saying, this is all relational, so it affects how we relate to each other. It affects how, we're judging each other's structures, assuming it's something the other person has chosen, because we have this feeling about ourselves that we've chosen everything that we're doing, or we've chosen everything that we're thinking, or we think we're aware of our motivations. So we're not seeing our own structures. We're not seeing how they influence our own choices, and we're assuming all of that for another person. So that's one aspect of the relational dynamic. The other part is that when we're faced with something unconscious, if we really reinforce this idea that as we are now is a choice, when it's not, it's a construction. But when we feel that identified with this construction, anything that's unconscious and not part of that presenting structure is that much harder to deal with.
That's really well worded.
So I just want to say, because I think it's tough to hear that, it's a threat to society as a whole, but it's because of how it affects us all individually.
Yeah.
It's not an external threat. It's our internal threat that we bring to the world every day.
Right. Yeah. Again, that's really, I like how you worded that. Why aren't we doing your podcast and I'm just chiming in every once in a while?
I think in general you have a lot more to say than I do, Lance. I just occasionally have something to say.
Yeah, I have more to say, but do I know more?
That's not for either of us to decide. That's funny. If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.